Hello and welcome to my Javelin tutorial from the Suicide Squad. This tutorial will talk you through the base structure of the Javelin. The first thing I did before starting was plan out the Javelin. I made this drawing which consists of 6 dowels and a pipe. I designed it with travel in mind so it can be unscrewed. The part that screws on and off will be between dowel A and dowel B. The pipe goes around both dowels. The reason I made my dowel 2.3 meters long is I looked at reference photos and I looked at the average sizes of javelins in real life. The smaller javelins seem to be about 2.2 meters. I'm about 5'5", and I felt like 2.3 seemed to be the right size for me, but obviously for yourself, if you're a lot taller or shorter, you can obviously change the height so it's in proportion to you. If we took dowel A first, I've obviously got dowel C which is a bit thinner, and then I've got dowel E. The reason I've got these smaller dowels is because the javelin goes into a taper at the end, so I thought that staggering the width would allow me to bulk around it with foam clay or just foam while still having a strong structure. I would do the exact same thing to dowel B, dowel D and dowel F. Please note I later use 5mm and 1mm foam to bulk out the javelin and make the diameter a lot wider. The part I'm working on first is the connection between dowel A and dowel B that allows it to screw on and off. Both of these parts of the dowels will have inserts. This means that a threaded rod can be threaded into one of the sides, allowing the other dowel to be screwed onto that. So this is dowel A, and in order to add the insert I need to drill a hole. But I need the hole to be in the centre. The way I find is easiest to find the centre of a circle is to first of all take a set square. Take the 90-degree side of the set square and line it up with one of the edges. If you're going to use a biro pen, scrap it, it won't be very accurate. I found a fine nib pen which was much better. The place where these points hit the edge should be the correct place that you can draw the centre line in, but we obviously don't know where on that line is the centre, so we need to do it again with another area of the javelin end. The point where those two lines cross is the centre. To be able to screw the insert into the dowel, we need to drill a hole. In order to do this, you need to check the size of your insert. Mine's is M4. The most ideal equipment to use for this is a pillar drill. However, I don't have one and a lot of people won't just have one in their garage. So I'm using a handheld electric drill. The biggest challenge with drilling this hole is trying to make it straight. The best thing you can do here to try and make it straight is sort of look at it from the side, look at it from the above, and just kind of judge that you've got it straight, and that's all you can really do. I don't know of any other method that you could make this straight unless you made some sort of jig or something like that. So I would really recommend doing some practice runs before you do this. When I started this, I was a little unsure about what size of drill to use, so I started small and then built it up until I was confident that it was the right size. So if you aren't sure about what size of drill, just make sure you choose one lower than the inner diameter of your thread, and you can always increase the drill size until you get the right one. When you're drilling the hole as well, you want it to be the length of your insert. You don't want to drill too far in. I checked the size of the insert and it doesn't fit, so I just up the size of the drill bit a little bit each time until I'm happy. The inserts I found weren't that long, so I actually tried putting 2 back to back, and it did work somewhat, but I would recommend looking for an insert that's maybe just a bit longer than the ones I found. I think these were like a centimetre or something like that. To screw in the insert, I'm just using a regular screwdriver. You could also use an attachment on an electric drill. It is a little tough at first doing this, but it will eventually go in if it's the right size of diameter. When screwing in the insert, make sure it goes flush to the top of the dowel. So I do the same method for dowel A and dowel B. Then I take a threaded rod that's also M4 and I cut it to the right size with a little hacksaw. Also to mention, this clamp is a G-clamp. I would not recommend cutting anything without clamping it down first, or if you've got a vise, using that. This helps control, and it's also for your own safety. If there are any burrs on the metal after cutting, you can use a file to remove them. The metal rod is then screwed into an insert on one side. We can now start adding the smaller dowels. So now on the opposite ends of the dowels, I'm going to drill a hole big enough to be able to glue these smaller dowels in. I make a pilot hole first just to be able to guide the next drill through. Then I use a larger 9mm drill until the dowel goes in happily. So before I glue this dowel in, I want to make it the right length. I refer back to my planning drawing when I do this. Whenever I'm making a straight cut like this, I like to use a Mitre Saw. You can see it has supports which helps keep the blade straight, so you always know your cut's going to be at 90 degrees. It's perfect for smaller wooden parts like this. I then measure and cut the dowel that goes on the opposite side. So now I have two dowels that I can glue to taper out the ends of both sides. And this is what it's going to look like. But before we do that, we need to glue it. To glue dowels C and D to dowels A and B, I'm going to use Gorilla Glue. The reason I've chosen this glue is it has a strong bond with wood. It also expands up to 3 times. So with wood there's obviously some crevices and grains and things like that. And I think it's good to use this glue because it kind of seeps into all those crevices and really strengthens that bond. When using Gorilla Glue, you need to add water. So I take a spray bottle with water in it and spray the inside of dowel A. I then spray the very end of dowel C. So obviously you don't want to use a lot of this glue or you'll find it foaming out of the joint. With dowel A upright, I add some Gorilla Glue into the hole. I then add dowel C, keep them upright and let them dry. The main thing to do here is make sure that it looks straight. So I have a pipe which is going to be the handle and I need to cut it to the correct length. So using the design I had before, my drawing, I cut it using the Mitre Saw. If you don't have a Mitre Saw, you can just use a regular hacksaw or something like that. Just make sure it's clamped down first or in a vise. So you can see now that the pipe hides the join now between dowel A and dowel B. So now I'm working out where to glue this pipe. Dowel A and dowel B are not the exact same length, so what I want to do here is find the middle and that will allow me to work out where to glue this pipe. The best way to do it is just measure the full length of dowel A and dowel B together, half it, then take half the length of the pipe and measure out both ways and make a mark. So the pipe is going to be glued to dowel A, not dowel B, as dowel B is going to be the removable part. The important thing here is to know what material you're gluing. This pipe is PVC, which is a plastic, and we're trying to glue that to wood. Now the first thing about plastic is it's usually really smooth. Glue tends to want to attach itself to something with a bit more grip. So what I do is I take a bit of rough sandpaper, stick it around a scrap bit of dowel, and I sand the inside of the pipe where I want to glue. I do not use contact cement for this, as there is no way I could slide the pipe over the dowel. It would just keep sticking. So I use epoxy glue. Epoxy comes in 2 parts, you mix them and then you apply. I've actually brought the Gorilla brand one. It comes with a wooden stick which is ideal for mixing, and the actual packaging is the tray that you use. Similar to the plastic, I also sand the wood. I only do this just because I want to ensure I get the strongest bond possible. To use the glue, I snap off the lid. And then what you do here is you want to have equal amounts coming out both sides. Make sure you put the lid back on the glue or you'll find it drying out a bit quickly. So I mix the glue thoroughly as per instructions and then I use the little wooden stick to apply it to the wood. Then what I do is slide on the pipe and I'll stop at the reference point so that it's glued in the correct spot. I then leave this straight to dry. So before we go to the next step of adding detail and everything, we just want to bulk it out with the foam and create a base. Foam is nice and flexible and light, it is perfect for this project. So firstly I'm focusing on dowel A and dowel B. Now to decide on the diameter that I want this dowel to be, I looked at reference photos and I also looked at things I had around the house. Like I looked at a curtain rail, I looked at like a broom handle, and I kind of judged to see what would be the right kind of diameter for this. I decided that the rough diameter I wanted to get is 32mm. The diameter of dowels A and B is 18mm, so that means for the diameter we want to have 14mm extra of foam, 7 on one side and 7 on the other side. I know I'm putting details on the top of this javelin, and the details are going to be 1mm. So if I take 1mm off both sides, then you're left with 6mm foam on either side that we need to make up to bulk it out. I don't have foam that's 6mm, but I have foam that's 5mm and foam that's 1mm. So the first thing I'm going to do is add 1mm foam to dowel A. What I do first is just ensure that the very edge of this foam is straight. To know what width of foam to cut is a bit tricky. All I actually did here was work out the circumference equals 2πr equation and then added on like a centimetre or so. There will be excess getting cut off anyway, so don't worry about this measurement being exact. But obviously the more foam you cut, the more waste you're going to have, so just keep that in mind. After measuring, I use a steel rule and a biro to mark in the lines. I then use a Stanley knife and cut down the lines. When cutting, put a slight amount of pressure on the steel rule to hold it in place, but keep your fingers well out of the way. If possible, I would use a longer steel rule. This is all I had at the time, although since I have updated and I actually have one that's a metre in length for my next project. You could also use an X-Acto knife for this. So now we have our foam strip which will go around dowel A. Before I can glue it on, I rough up the wood just to give it a little bit more grip. My glue of choice is contact cement, which is both compatible with wood and foam. Wearing gloves, I then take the plastic applicator and apply the glue all over the strip. It's important that the entire piece of foam is covered in the glue. Be careful not to miss out the edges. Also note that you can dispense the contact cement into a little applicator. I actually kept it in the tin for this as I was using it on a huge project right after I filmed this. But it does react with air and it can get quite gloopy quickly. So you want to make sure that your glue will last. Once my entire piece of foam is covered in the glue, I then apply the glue to the wood. It's important that you put contact cement on both surfaces to be glued together. With contact cement, you really want to have thin layers as well. If you put too much on, it really is not as effective. You really want to have the most minimal amount of glue on there. You need to ensure both surfaces are dry before you actually glue them together. If the surface is still tacky at all, then it's not ready to be glued. Once both surfaces are dry, I then line them up to glue them together. I assure that the dowel is straight and in line with the foam. What I then do is use a rolling motion to make sure that there's no gaps where the foam meets the dowel and that they glue together seamlessly. Then when I reach the seam, I press down as much as I can, as the seam is the most important part. You really need that to be glued down properly. I continue the process for dowel B. You might find it easier to do this without gloves and just press down onto the seam. Make sure there aren't any gaps where that seam is. I'm also going to bulk out the handle. Since it's plastic, we really need to make sure that we're sanding it with some rough grit sandpaper. First, I double check the length of my measurement. Then I do the circumference equals 2πr equation to work out how much foam I'm going to cut. And then as before, I add on a couple of centimetres, just in case. I use the exact same process for gluing. Contact cement will work totally fine when gluing the plastic to the foam. As before, I then line up both surfaces and use that rolling technique to ensure there are no gaps. And I press along the seam line. So now that these three parts of the javelin have been covered in foam, there will be an excess amount of foam at the seam. Using some scissors, I cut off the largest bits that are sticking up from the seam. I then sand it down by hand with some sandpaper. I just hand sanded for this because I feel like a Dremel might disrupt the foam as it's only 1mm in thickness. So we've added 1mm thickness on either side of the dowels and the pipe. To make it 6mm on each side, I'm going to use a 5mm thickness foam and add that around the outside. I use the circumference equals 2 pi r equation to work out the width of the foam that I need to cut. Again, I mark this on the foam using a steel rule and a biro, and then I use my Stanley knife to cut it out. I glue it in the exact same way with the contact cement. It doesn't really matter where the seams are going to be on the Javelin, it's all going to be covered with detail later. So when you're adding the 5mm foam, it is a bit more difficult to roll it, so what you can do is just add some gentle heat, and that makes the foam just that bit more flexible that you can work with it a lot better, and make sure it's glued right round. Again, I cut off the excess with some scissors, and then I push down into the seam with my fingers to ensure there are no gaps. I continue cutting out foam for the dowels and repeat the process. Again, to work out the minimum width of foam I need to cut, I use the circumference equals 2 pi r equation. Javelins taper out at the ends. To create this effect, I'm going to bulk out dowels C and D with foam. I'll use thicker foam to bulk out the bottom of the dowels, and then thinner amounts of foam to bulk out the ends. Then what I can do is smooth it all out with a Dremel. You can see I've measured out and planned where all the foam is going to be glued. I cut out small sections of foam in varying thicknesses and glue them on. I repeat the process for the other side. For the thicker pieces of foam, I use a heat gun to add gentle heat and allow me to flex it around the dowel. I now just add some extra layers at the bottom of the dowel. Now that I have all my foam added to bulk it out and to add the taper, I am now going to Dremel everything to get it smooth. I start with the main body of the Javelin, and I just Dremel continuously up and down until I get that seam smooth and less noticeable. Just a reminder that I will be adding detail on top of this, so most of the seam will not be visible anyway. Now I Dremel the ends in the hope to get it looking more like a conical shape, so that the very ends taper out to a point. You can see I'm Dremeling the areas that really need to be smoothed down. There's obviously going to be seams in between all this foam, so just to point out, I am actually going to skin this later with 1mm foam, so all of these seams will be hidden as well. You can see I've added foam clay here, and what it does is it's just acted as a filler. So if there was any sort of divide in between each bit of foam, it's just filled that for me. And you can Dremel over the foam clay as well. So the first time I actually designed this, I wasn't quite sure how I was going to taper to a point, because you need the structure underneath. I still had about 10 centimetres of taper I wanted to add, so adding this dowel will ensure there's structure underneath. I do the same process as before, find the centre, drill a hole and glue in the dowel. If there was one part of my project I would go back and change, it would be this part. I thought I would be fine with the wooden dowel at the end, but there's still a bit of flex even underneath the foam when I add it. So I would suggest using something that's different from this dowel. So lastly, what I did was use the foam clay to fill out the rest of this conical shape on the end of the javelin. Once it had set, I hand sanded it. This allows for more control over finalising the smoothness of these ends. We're sanding with a much larger surface area, so it will be more effective. You really want to use a sanding block when doing this. It will help ensure the edges of the taper are nice and straight. I sand both sides until I'm content with the smoothness of them. In the next tutorial, we add detail and we actually skin the ends of the javelin. Thanks for watching and see you at the next tutorial.